It was a dance when Bond attempted to open the door for Senator J.P. Clark on the way out of the office at the Dirksen Senate office building. Clark wouldn't have it and held the door himself, insisting the other pass through. Clark was better than 6 feet tall, built like a linebacker but nothing but a target of opportunity to Bond. He could have snapped his throat without fail. The carnival of manners somehow unwound, and they entered the Great Hall and began to walk along the Capitol to the Senate itself, where Senator Adams was waiting in his hideaway office above the Senate chamber, which Daniel Webster had long ago laid the cornerstone for. It's amazing how much creativity one might turn to building identity. Instead, Tech Branch kept it simple. Any genuinely professional examination would have shown that Boris Black was a creation of intelligence officers. The senators liked to have private meetings, so they had developed ways of getting around checks that would put their contacts on the security apparatus database. Bond had to rely on this shield. Bond thought, as though for no reason, of a time when he was in school, having recently gone up to Cambridge. His face went blank, and he followed Clark mechanically down the Capitol paths towards the Senate. He had hit up a drunken Albanian language instructor about the mechanics of sexual seduction at a lunch bowl session. Bond had maneuvered himself into the guzzle fest on the chance that he might pump the old man for something worth knowing. Bond had built up the pesky, nagging friendship with the old man by letting him in on the details of some of his affairs of late. Dr. Zog, so she lets you do it in the ass? And doggy style. Really? A girl like that? I didn't think she would go more than missionary. He seemed very interested, and prattled on. Dr. Zog? And was her ass especially odoriferous? Or had she obviously washed it very carefully expecting you? At the right moment, Bond asked the critical question which had bothered him for the last month. Bond, what factors change with an older woman? Dr. Zog was Roush. His whiskers about his mustache were tingling under the red wine, intoxicated to the fullness, had been guzzling a fare to middling Côtes de Rhône. Replete, half blacked out but drawing on a stock of profound reflections, he uttered the following famous words. Dr. Zog, an older woman is the same as any woman, all women are identical. Bond understood at once. Marxists. The old dog in a bow tie who looked a bit like Lyndon Johnson said and made a sour face as though he were talking about some kind of monsters. Bond understood a special genus of the enemies of Trump or the Trumpian futurism to come were identical to this group of stiffs in suits. Were themselves, of a muchness. They were de facto, from a liberal media point of view, a claque of Trump-deplored Reno Republicans exchanging scuttlebutt in a corridor of the United States Senate building about some gilt-glowing insignias and decor. But that's a gene pool I wouldn't want to dip into. And he chuckled crassly at his own joke. Old DC insider. They need a basic civics course, the experienced old DC insider said straightforwardly. J.P. Clark showed Bond into the office of Senator Jordan L. Adams. J.P. Clark. This is that fella I was telling you about, Jordan, about the drills, Boris Black. Excuse me, gentlemen, I have to run. Bond, thank you so much, Jerry, Bond said and shook his hand firmly. Clark was gone as though swallowed by the earth, and Bond found himself, after a handshake and a thanks for coming out to see us, sitting on a leather chair on the other side of Adams' polished wood desk, on which a neat clutter of papers stood, and no phone or computer. Nonetheless, though there was no Musk tech, Bond thought he was one step closer right-wing counter-woke. Senator Adams, Boris, you're a Brit I understand, and you used to work for Cross Harbor, good firm. Bond, they're the best, but they don't sell diamond-tipped drill bits. I like being close to stuff that sparkles, Senator. Senator Adams, don't we all? Listen, we've got all we can do deconstructing this administrative state. The Doge is up and running. These bastards have committed vast crimes. When they're out, there'll be plenty of monies ready to be earmarked for your drill bits. Now listen, Black, I need a man I can trust. I trust you implicitly, to liaise at Fort Bonsteel in Kosovo. There's all kinds of activity going on there. Bond, okay, Senator, you've got a man. Well, maybe. Bond scratched his head. He wasn't sure how far to go with the charade. Bond, probably, I have to run it by the boys at my shop. Senator Adams, you just do that and I'll have the packet drawn up with all the specs. Bond, you're sure they're gonna free up those funds? Bond teased playfully. Senator Adams, as sure as Donald John Trump is president of this great land, we'll have this country's finances made whole again. Vast crimes are being uncovered as we speak. You can be sure of it, my friend. Black, we need a good aggressive man like you on the team. I see it in your eyes." The senator seemed self-reserved in a profoundly stately reverie, as though he had just spoken to the assembled body of the Senate itself. Bond was at ease and enjoying his role as Boris Black, drill bit hawker. He didn't really know what he was looking for. And if after all the whole thing led nowhere, there was still his appointment with Felix at the site of the killing in the bar. After they had been talking for 10 minutes, a little rap came at the door. Senator Adams. "Yes, come in," said Adams without saying a word to Bond. "Matilda, sir, you asked to let you know if a call came in from Kosovo. Someone called Poggy is on your primary line. Thanks, Matilda." And she ducked back out of the room. Adams took a little white phone out of his jacket pocket and glanced at the face of it. "Senator Adams, listen. Boris, big donor, big Poggy, funny guy, on the phone. Maybe you'll meet up with him one of these days. I've got to take the call. I'll have Matilda send the package with everything you need to you at the Four Seasons. That's where you are, right?" Bond nodded, smiled, and backed out of the room and closed the door behind him, as though walking on eggshells. A sudden access of giddiness made a rare visitation on James Bond. Kosovo? That could be important. He'd check it out with Felix. His fugue state of mind jittered up again like bubbles from fish in a pond. 8 shots to the heart would be sheer sadism, he thought. But 3 was justified for redundancy. He envisaged 3 shots to 8's left eye as a clinking of the glasses in death. Maybe he did kill that way. Bond had his Boris Whitephone's Apple Books app read him The Last Hour of the Comanche Empire by the Finnish historian Pekka Hamalainen. He was trotting about the Capitol grounds. It was still an hour before he was supposed to meet up with Felix and ride over to check out the bookshop where the Griffith White killing happened. Moody, Angela Merkel's bio, was next up, just as there are sequences in De Palma's Body Double which do Vertigo's tailing of the girl through a high-end shopping outing, and as she traverses tourist locations better, more Hitchcockian than Hitchcock. Maybe the Egyptians had improved on Giovanni Gentile and Mussolini's invention, fascism. The Americans didn't care about fascism per se, as long as it wasn't in Europe. Neo-Mamluk governments like that of Sisi were unobjectionable to policymakers and the intelligence community. The way Zizek explained it was that there was a kind of path from the Balkans, barbarians, to London. The Muslims were beyond the frontier, not even barbarians. There was a story, typical of the fascist Muslim states supported by the Saudis as in the modern Egypt, with billions paid out to Sisi, and in other countries by the Americans. Of a general who cornered the poultry market by passing a law that allowed him to sell to the army and the public. He used the army as labor without paying them anything extra. Naturally, though there was a market, nobody could compete with his prices. Bond couldn't see that it was so bad that people got cheaper poultry, and the men were not slaves, but a kind of honored Silovoki class. And they could quit if they wanted. If Bond were right, and 8 were behind the killing in Egypt, why was 8 killing the religion which resisted tyrants? Why was he speeding the work of the Dajjal? Some people probably like the old version of Don't Stop the Music by Yarborough and Peoples better than the Rihanna version. But, wasn't it something of the love of the classics, and not of life? Everyone naturally considers Hitler's fascism as more serious than our own living fascisms, which are just Rihanna and Brian De Palma. But, what is this effect of the bending of time? We need a third example in this kind of series to see how age happens, how museum pieces pretend to be alive, Bond thought. What kind of government is 8 about? All his reflections calmly passed over a vast enigma. A grungy white duck shook its ass on the CC concrete rim of the reflecting pond as though to say, eat shit to the human world, which was of no genuine concern to it. About a dozen people were visible. A few more ducks quietly floated on the waters. In some Muslim countries, the Sufis were de facto destroyed, because their shrines and brotherhood meeting places, though not destroyed, were made museums, where it was permitted to look, but not to gather together in reverence and joy, not to pray. Without prayer, it became impossible to oppose tyranny in Turkey. The Sufis become the Mojahedin and revolted in Iran, the only non-fascist country in Islam. Bond noticed how the Americans tended to disregard this and superimpose their so-called realism, which didn't admit religious Dasein existed in the way they claimed to, but saw them as operating under the same restraints of regime survival as all states. Bond's phone rang. They decided to meet over by the Vietnam Memorial. When Felix pulled up on Constitution Ave, Bond opened the door to Felix's high-end Mercedes-Benz. It seemed repellently flashy to him. Bond looked as though in hesitation. "Felix." Hey James. Bond. Hey Felix, what's with the car? You trying to get in GQ? Bond stood as though considering reservations on the curb as though he weren't getting in. Felix, isn't that a fag rag? Bond, that's what I mean. Bond was looking at the Lux interior. Felix, I'm a geek for high-performance vehiculation. Bond, of course you are, Bond riposted. Felix, what do you drive, brother? Bond, I've got a Kawasaki. Felix smiled. Felix, Boris baby, get in. Bond got in and closed the door.